As some of you, I understand, have not had any connection with the Architecture Foundation before, I'd like to just explain a little bit about who we are and what we're doing. The Architecture Foundation was started in 2001 with the Glenn Murcutt Masterclass, which has been held every year since in either July or September, except 1 year during the global financial crisis when we decided to give it a rest. We've had people from over 80 nations visit Australia to take part in this 2-week residential program. And that program has built the basis for what we do at the Architecture Foundation. We're a not-for-profit organization. We work on substantially voluntary labor, and we need whatever support we can get. And we're really pleased to have you here tonight, new people that have had no connection with us before. That's our website, aussietecture.org. You can visit it and you can browse it, and there's lots of interesting information there. There's information on events that we've held, including some things that I'm going to show you now. Also, there's a great collection of projects by those alumni from our master classes, etc., around the world, now on the website. Some really interesting work. We have, as well as the masterclass, started in 2005, a summer school for student architects at Pittwater YSA with Richard and Peter. And this is a sort of typical view of what goes on at those. And that's gone every year and will go again 2020. I think we've done 15 years of that. And we've hundreds of young architects that have been part of that. We've also toured an exhibition of Glenn's work, which started actually in this building about 2008, and that has been to many countries: Taipei, Vienna, Helsinki, Brussels, Ljubljana, Montreal, Glasgow, Phoenix, Bangkok, Sydney. They also toured Australia. So that was it, and that's just a picture of it in Phoenix, Arizona. And we've also been involved with the Sydney Living Museums, presenting the Iconic Houses exhibition, which was something we started, which has now toured, as you can see, Sydney, Adelaide, Port Macquarie, Dubbo, Newcastle, Canberra, Liverpool, Wagga, Nara, Grafton, Ipswich, taking architecture, great iconic houses based on Karen McCartney's books to the people in regional Australia. We had a fantastic conference in Melbourne. We had 12 international speakers, fantastic speakers, and 10 of the 12 were actually alumni from the Murcutt Masterclass. So Judith is a professor at the Department of Architecture, University of Oregon, distinguished professor of the Association of AACA in the USA, went to the AA in London for a period, and then eventually did her master's at Princeton. Head of the Department of Architecture, University of Oregon, previously professor and chair of architecture at Cal Poly University, Pomona. Is that right? Yeah. She's director also, an organization that she'll talk to you a bit about tonight, Tallwood Design Institute in Oregon, Oregon Timber, Big Trees, in collaboration with various parts of the University of Oregon and Oregon State. And she's just been in Australia giving a paper in Brisbane at the 5th Pacific Timber Engineering Conference in Brisbane. And that was our good fortune and been able to capture Judith here tonight. So Judith is also an award-winning architect, and she will show you a really lovely building that she's done with Norman Miller at Sea Ranch, a project or building that a complex you will all be familiar with. She has been recognized as the leading authority on the work of R.M. Schindler, and her publications include the brilliant Phaidon book published in 2001. It's my great privilege to welcome Judith to Australia, to Sydney, and here you are. Off you go.
Lindsay, thank you so much for inviting me here and being such a great host. Lindsay connected me with all kinds of architects who I wanted to talk to about mass timber, which was fantastic. And thank you, Glenn, for being such a great host. And it's my first time in Australia, and it's very exciting, and I hope to be able to come back many times. So tonight, as Lindsay said, Lindsay asked me to talk about three things, mostly about Schindler. Most of it will be about Schindler. I'm going to show one of my own projects, and then I'll talk a little bit about tall wood, and I'll try to make the transitions not too awkward. So let's start. Now, again, I hope everyone can understand my thick American accent, right? Originally from New York, so it's a little bit of that. Schindler, here's Schindler. He was born in 1887 in Vienna, and he came to Los Angeles and eventually died there in 1953. So Schindler was educated in Vienna, first at the Polytechnic and then the Academy of Fine Arts, and was in Vienna at a time when it was arguably the most culturally sophisticated place in the Western world, Western civilization. But he wound up in Los Angeles, which he came to in 1920. This is his own King's Roadhouse, as we call it, because it's on King's Road in West Hollywood, what is now West Hollywood. He came there in December 1920 to what was essentially a kind of frontier. So how did he get from one of the most sophisticated places on Earth to a place that really was basically a frontier? Well, we're going to get him there. So as I said, he went to the Academy of Fine Arts when it was so closely associated with Otto Wagner that it was known as the Wagner School. I hope nobody here speaks German because I'm going to mispronounce a couple of German words, right? The umlauts, the double, anyway. So this, as I'm sure most of you know, is Wagner's Postal Savings Bank of 1904 to 6. And Wagner was doing essentially historicist buildings in various Beaux-Arts styles until 1900, when he came out with a book which roughly translates from German to English as Modern Architecture, in which he claimed that architecture should use modern materials and methods and have forms that follow the purpose of the building, meaning that you no longer should use historical ornaments. So here you can just see kind of a pattern on the front of the building of the bolts holding the stone facade on, and inside he exposed light fixtures and heaters and all kinds of industrial things. And Schindler was a big admirer of his work. But even more than Otto Wagner, Schindler was exposed, like a lot of young architects at the time in Vienna, to the work of Adolf Loos. And Loos did not have a real school. He had a Bachschule. Again, I'm pronouncing it completely wrong. It was kind of informal school that really took place in coffee shops where people hung out and talked about deep ideas. And there were several deep ideas that came from Loos that stuck with Schindler through his entire career. The first was a complete and utter rejection of all applied ornament of all kind. And again, most of you are probably familiar with this famous 1908 essay, Ornament and Crime, in which he talks about how in civilized societies, only criminals and sailors ornament or tattoo their bodies. Therefore, if you tattoo or ornament a building, you're a criminal. So ornament and crime. I used to talk to audiences about this for years, and in my day, people maybe had a butterfly or a peace symbol. Now, of course, they're covered with tattoos, and anyway, they do not consider themselves to be criminals. Anyway, on the far side, this is the, I'm just going to check the date on this. It's the Steiner House of 1910, and this is the Shoe House of 1912. And you can see that all ornament is gone, but also there's a kind of asymmetry to the fenestration. And you can see here, this is a project at the Villa Noisy for the Venice Beach, Venice Lido in 1923, not built. But what you can see is what seems to be a two-story house. On the inside is revealed to be a many level house. And this was something that was later, I'm going to pronounce it again in German, later codified in the 30s as the Raum plan or space plan. And it is sometimes contrasted with Le Corbusier's free plan. So if Le Corbusier had this Maison Domino, a series of parallel concrete platforms held up by columns, it was known essentially as fixed section free plan. Whereas for Loos, the walls were still load-bearing, so fixed plan, but a kind of free section where he lowered ceilings and raised floors to create very different heights and shapes of spaces. And for Schindler, this idea of a complex section and a focus on the interior and shaping the space was to stick with him again throughout his career. But the biggest influence was probably this guy, Frank Lloyd Wright. And Schindler was introduced to Wright, like a lot of young architects in Europe, through the Wasmuth portfolio, which he actually saw in 1911 in the Academy of Fine Arts Library. On the top is the Cheney House from 1904 in Oak Park, and the lower one is the Coonley House from 1908 in Riverside, Illinois. And I'm sorry, you seem a little bit, especially the lower one, a little bit pale, but as radical as Loos's work was, Wright's work was just a complete revelation, with these nearly flat-hipped roofs floating above bands of clear-story windows and these houses spreading out, you know, prairie houses in the American prairie. And Schindler had already been influenced by Loos, who was a huge fan of American technology, especially their plumbing, and our plumbing, I guess, and had spent several years in America. And, but really, like a lot of young architects, he wanted to go work for Wright. So he answered an ad by a firm called Ottenheimer, Stern and Reichert in Chicago. It heard there were very good graduates in Austria. And he went off to America. And he was extremely lucky. He left in March 1914. I'm sure I don't have to tell you why that was a great time to leave Europe. And he landed in New York, and he spent 2 weeks there and just hated it. He thought like there were these amazing steel skeletons covered in historic crap. And he made his way to Chicago and finally met Frank Lloyd Wright. And he saw things like the Roby House of 1906. I always get it a little later. Which was really a revelation. Huge, you know, soaring cantilevers, floating planes, something completely abstract. And he really wanted to work for Wright, but Wright did not have work for him. You might remember 1914, bad year for Wright. His, you know, his mistress and children were killed by a servant, burned down Taliesin, you know, horrible thing. And he was busy in the office, didn't have enough work. So Schindler was anticipating the U.S. getting to the war. He thought he was going to be deported. So like a lot of young architects, he decided to take a train out west and tour the West. So he went to San Francisco and down to Los Angeles and San Diego. And in San Diego, he saw the work of another influence on him, the work of Irving Gill. And he would have met Gill probably through Lloyd Wright, Wright's eldest son, who was working for him. And Gill was an interesting figure in his own right. He came from upstate New York. He worked in the office of Louis Sullivan, probably under the direct supervision of Frank Lloyd Wright when he was there, and then made his way out to San Diego. Just like Wagner, he was doing historicist work, 1900, Revelation, started doing work a lot like Loos's, where completely stripped down, no ornament, and these hip roofs were added later. This is the Simmons House of 1910 and the Tietz House of 1912. You can see similarities. A number of people saw similarities there. And these are both in San Diego, but one of the houses that Schindler probably saw under construction is the Dodge House of 1914 to 16. In 1914, for reasons that are still not clear, Gill left San Diego and moved to Los Angeles. And he designed and built this fairly remarkable house for those years, asymmetric windows, and probably Schindler would have seen it through Lloyd Wright. And it will figure later in the story because this Dodge House was on an estate which was broken up. It was on Kings Road, and when water finally came down Kings Road, that's a whole lecture in itself, how water basically is kind of the urban design history of LA. They broke up the estate into parcels, and Schindler and his wife Pauline purchased one almost across the street from the Dodge House to build the Kings Road house. But we have to get Schindler back to Chicago first. So Schindler stopped in New Mexico in the device of some of his artist and architecture friends in Chicago. These are his own photographs. This is one of the mission-style buildings in Santa Fe, and this is the Taos Pueblo. And Schindler was enormously impressed by what he saw. He felt that he'd finally found a kind of indigenous American architecture in this and in the American log cabin. He felt that everything that Americans called their own colonial was basically just watered-down European. And you will see some of the influence of this clearly in his own Kings Road house. So he makes it back to Chicago and still isn't deported, much to his surprise, even though we're in the war. And he finally found work in February 1918 for Wright, because Wright was extremely busy at the time and spending most of his time in Tokyo working on the Imperial Hotel. And Schindler did some drawings for the hotel, but while Wright was in Tokyo, he worked in the Oak Park House and Studio. This was from 1885, actually keeping it for Wright and doing a whole bunch of work for him there, later subject of some dispute, but clearly there's a bunch of letters now sitting in the Getty collection that it took 2 months to send letters by train and boat to Japan and get them back. And Schindler would send plans, and Wright had notes on them saying, change a few things, send it out, get it built, we need the money. So clearly, Schindler had a lot of responsibility. And he also spent time at Taliesin. This is the second Taliesin. The first one, remember, burnt down. This is the second one. And Schindler took more, these are Schindler's own photos. I'll show you a few more. Schindler took more photographs of Taliesin than he did of anything else. It was a fairly amazing project, spreading out in the landscape beyond what any of the prairie houses had done. Again, with these huge cantilevers and big areas of glass, like, again, nothing anybody had ever seen. These are some, I apologize, kind of very fuzzy photographs, again, originals of Schindler, showing it fitting into the hillside. And it also shows, you can just barely see it here, some of the Japanese prints and other objects that Wright brought back from Japan, as well as some young Japanese architects who Schindler worked with. And Japanese architecture, Schindler never made it to Japan. Wright kept thinking he was bringing him over, but he did not, was another influence that you'll see on Schindler's work. And instead of going to Japan, which Wright kept talking about, Wright had one very important American client, Aileen Barnsdall, who was an oil heiress. And Wright had, she had commissioned Wright to design a theater complex for her in Chicago. And then she moved to Los Angeles and bought a hill, Olive Hill, which is this hill. And she commissioned Wright to design a house and theater complex there. So Schindler had done the drawings in Oak Park, and Lloyd Wright was working on the project, but Aileen Barnsdall was not happy with it. So Wright sent his most experienced guy, Schindler, out to Southern California, where he arrived in December 1920. By then he had married Pauline Gibling, who herself, again, part of another lecture, was very interesting. She had gone to Smith College and taught cello and done some interesting things, and they thought they were going to be moving back to Europe, but economic conditions were so awful. Neutra kept writing, trying to get sponsored to come here, that Schindler worked on the Barnsdall house, which also known as the Hollyhock house, and it's called as the stylized hollyhocks around it. And I think, as far as I can tell, was not very happy with this house. All the lightness that he found in the prairie style houses became something really heavy here. This is actually not a concrete house. It's actually hollow block and stucco. And variously referred to as inspired by Mayan or Aztec influences. Schindler thought it was historicist, heavy, dark, not really what he wanted to do. And by September 1921, it was substantially complete. And he had to decide if he was going to stay in Southern California or go back to Europe. And he decided to stay. So, and build his own house, the King's Road House, in 1921 to 22. So before I embark on his American journey, I just want to do a little bit of theory. So while Schindler was still a student in Vienna, in either 1912 or 1913, he wrote a manifesto called Modern Architectural Program. And in it, he declared, unlike Le Corbusier and a lot of other architects, in it he declared that the 20th century was the first to abandon structure and construction as a source for form. Abandon it, rather than the new concrete and steel dictating new formal language. For Schindler, you could abandon it. Instead of the old lithic architecture where you had to depend on load-bearing walls to define your form, with concrete and steel, he said that the architect can design things in any shape the architect wanted. And instead of the materials of construction, the new architecture, which he called space architecture, the new medium of his art would be space, climate, light, and mood. Space, climate, light, and mood. And you can see in Southern California, we can live inside and outside pretty much at the same time, that this idea of Schindler's about designing around space, climate, light, and mood was something that the space architect would do throughout his career. There's a few other things you can see here that are things that you will see over and over in the work. This is his own house from 21 to 22. This is the Tischler house of 1949 to 50 at the end of his career. And superficially, they look very little alike. Schindler was wildly inventive and changed vocabularies all through his career. But apart from these spatial ideas of space, climate, light, and mood, there were also a bunch of other spatial ideas, some of which I'll talk about now and some a little later. Oops. Some a little later. There we go, right, a little faster than I thought. That were to stay current throughout his life. The idea of these kind of low horizontal datums and something going on in the roof with clerestory lighting above it. Diagonal views and diagonal movement through the face, not as much in Tischler as in most of the others. entering to small compressed spaces and explosion to bigger ones, very Wrightian, and also complete and utter continuity between inside and out are things that you can see in all of Schindler's work, even though there's big changes in material all along the way. All right, so we now have him in Los Angeles, thank God. And he designed and built this house and decided to stay, as he describes it, in Southern California when he was camping in Yosemite Park on the shores of Lake Tenaya. And he built it, he said, with just the absolute minimum that you need, something to keep the rain off your head and the roof off your back. And it is pretty primitive, especially in a rainy winter. But it's, anyway, I'm a little biased. I'm still on the board of the Schindler House. I'm a vice president of the board, so I'm extremely biased. But I still think it's an incredibly beautiful piece of architecture. And but when it was first built, this is what it looked like. It was kind of surrounded by soybean fields. Again, the Dodge house had the Dodge estate had just opened it up. And you can see it, and this was before they put the sleeping baskets on, because they couldn't afford them right away. And you can see that it looks like a kind of fort sitting in the middle of the desert, very much like the missions. And just a little later, this is 22, this is 1924. This is a still from a Buster Keaton movie called Sherlock Jr., in which Buster Keaton has a dream, and he steals a bicycle, and he steals something from a cop at a policeman's chase. I don't know what's happening. Anyway, it's very fascinating, but who cares? Because here's the King's Road house. That's all we really care about. So, but it looks like this kind of fort. It's surrounded by little buildings, little Spanish-style roofs, and it does look like it just landed from some other planet. But it's kind of interesting to see it without the landscape at first, because it looks completely different, and really, in the end, cannot be understood without the landscape, which makes a really important continuous piece with it. So this is, of course, an original plan of Schindler's. And one of the revolutionary things about it is the plan. There's nothing like a dining room or a living room or anything normal. And Schindler is very proud of this. He was sending the blueprints to everybody, to Neutra and Louis Sullivan. And Louis Sullivan wrote back and said, "You sent me the blueprints purporting to be the plans of a house. As no explanation came with it, I couldn't make it out at all." Right, so send him this, who could make it out? So this, unbelievably, that says RMS, SPG, MDCG. Anyway, this is Schindler's own studio. This was Pauline's studio. This had a friend of hers from Smith College, Marion DeCamera Case, had this studio. And Clyde, not DeCamera, Clyde Chase, I can't remember his middle name, who was an engineering contractor and worked on a number of Irving Gill buildings, had this one. The idea is each adult had their own studio. They had a little entryway with a little bathroom. They slept in the sleeping baskets upstairs. There's a communal kitchen, a guest room, and a garage. And it was fairly primitive. And for me, what is most interesting about the plan, though, is the way it achieves a kind of perfect figure-ground balance. So you can read this three-wheeled pinwheel of the house made up of an L-shaped wing of the Schindler wing, an L shape of the Chase wing, and the other L made up of these three pieces as a figure in the landscape. But you can also absolutely read these L shapes forming figural outdoor patios that are defined by hedgerows, drops in the landscape, this idea of the varied section from Lowe's continuing out into the landscape. And you can see that these spaces, just like you can sort of see, each of these interior spaces have their own fireplace. Each of these outdoor patios have their own fireplaces. And they were basically used as the outdoor living rooms. Now, the other thing about it was its construction system. And Schindler spent the 20s really experimenting with concrete, reinforced concrete. And the experiments were all trying to make it cheap enough. As you all know, you're architects. To build concrete, you have to build a wall first and then build the concrete, and it takes a lot of labor. So this was the first experiment, and Schindler made a series of tilt-up walls out of tapered concrete, 4 inches at the top, 8 inches at the bottom, and poured them right on a concrete slab, no foundations. LA, seismic zone, a little bit of an issue, and with some oiled burlap down. You can see here that there's an L shape in the section also of floor and wall, and an L shape of very light redwood framing that makes up the roof and the outer walls with sliding canvas doors and with glazing. These are on a 4-foot module, something that Schindler used throughout his career. There's a little bit of rebar in them sticking out. Schindler, once they were tilted up, he poured a little bit of concrete to make a key and then put in a slot of glass, marking both the module and allowing a little light in. So this was the process. This is not Schindler, Clyde Chase, just other people, right? And slab was poured, oiled burlap. In fact, in Clyde Chase's room, which they started in, you can see the wrinkles in the wall. They eventually smoothed it out. By the time you get halfway through the house, no wrinkles. And this was the system. The walls were also made stable because they were fatter at the bottom, but also they formed kind of U's and L's to make up the plan. And this is what the house looks like. These pictures were taken for my last book, published in 2012, written with Bob Sweeney, who's the president of the Friends of the Schindler House. And you can see here this kind of figure ground integration where the house is completely integrated into the landscape with these very defined outdoor spaces. And you enter each of the wings at a corner. You kind of enter here into this very low space. You're here looking diagonally out at a previously completely hidden patio looking at the fireplace. And this kind of diagonal view continues through the house. You enter the rooms typically at corners, looking at a corner fireplace. You're going to see this kind of composition a lot in Schindler. Half a room divided, fireplace on one side, here slit windows, usually clear story, and a corner window that you can see here, and a floor completely open to an outdoor space. So that here we remove the sliding canvas doors for photographs. So that you're completely one with the outside, which in the mild Southern California climate really works. There's no corridors. You either pass from room to room or you can pass here under an overhang if it rains, which even in LA occasionally does. This was Pauline's studio with some of the original furniture and some reproductions, and again, heated by fireplace. Schindler generally put, unlike Wright, put the big hearth in the corner. On the very few occasions he made it out of metal, it was actually placed in the center of the room. This is the Clyde Chase sign, which eventually became the Neutra side in 1925 when Neutra and his family moved in. The interior partitions were made out of this insulite. It's a material left over from making sugarcane and could be reconfigured. And this little space was reconfigured from a nursery to an office, but similarly, you enter in a low space looking out into the garden. And again, you get these diagonal views against the carefully defined courtyard. Again, corner windows are ubiquitous, and diagonal views. This is the Chase courtyard, and again, you can see defined by an L shape, a hedge, and a big drop in the landscape to define this nice outdoor patio. And again, from the back, you can see the Schindler house kind of glowing at night, completely open, and again, very much like a camper's shelter with very little protection from the elements. So this was probably Schindler's favorite building. He lived here had his entire life until the last few months of his life and practiced here. There's a very long social history, which I clearly don't have time for now, involving lots of interesting bohemian activity and lots of people in the house, but I'm going to completely ignore it to move on to the architecture. So in general in Schindler, I'm going to show you a number of these. I've had my students over the years do a number of section cuts through the building because that's what gets really interesting, is that you can almost do an infinite number of section cuts and find something new each time. So now we're going to move, I'm going to apologize because I'm going to move very quickly through a lot of stuff, through a bunch of other experiments. So Schindler made another kind of experiment with concrete in the Pueblo Ribera house, Pueblo Ribera Court, which is 12 little vacation cottages in La Jolla, Southern California, near San Diego, in 1924. And you can see here, he was thinking of it as kind of little mission-style village. And you can see the lines in the concrete. He developed something here. I should show the plan first. You can see there isn't really room to lay down tilt-up slabs. He essentially made these little miniature King's Road houses out of each of them with kitchen, bedroom, living room, completely open to a privatized patio. And again, let me just go what I think is back, with a sleeping porch up above, which had an amazing view of the ocean. So he developed here something called the slab cast system, where to save on formwork, he made these forms with some rebar sticking up and poured one board at a time, let it cure overnight, moved the boards up, there's some paper there as well, and slowly built up the wall of the house. You can see in this diagram here how it worked. So this was a fantastic idea and seemed like it would save formwork and work well, but unfortunately, they seem to have used some sand from the beach with too much lime, and the place leaked like a sieve. So really unfortunate. So there's not much original left, though somebody recently spent a huge amount of money and effort restoring one of the units, which looks amazing. These are some photographs of the little that was left a number of years ago. Some burned down. It's kind of very tragic. But Schindler used the same method much more successfully in the Howe House of 1925, which is in Silver Lake, which is a kind of area just northwest of downtown Los Angeles, which is full of Schindler houses and apartments. I used to live in the Saks apartments for many, many years in LA. And the house uses the slab cast system. It's on a very steeply sloping site, as you can see here. This is the street side, non-street side. And Schindler takes this module, used a 4-foot module that he divided into 1/3 or 16 inches, 1 2/3 module, 6/8. I'm sorry, it's all imperial, door height, which he used in both the glazing and in the redwood siding. And Schindler, these are his own presentation drawings. And again, you can see Schindler drew not only a plan, he drew the clear story plan and the upper plan, because lots of stuff went up above this datum. And this is another L-shaped house where the upper floor is wrapped around an outdoor terrace, and the lower floor with the bedrooms is wrapped around a garage dug into the hillside. And you can see here the 16-inch in really everything. This is a view through the house. Some of you may be familiar with Wright's Freeman House of 1924 in Los Angeles. Schindler had, by now departed from Wright, was working on his own. It has these very well-known 2-story corner windows, but otherwise is bilaterally symmetrical, the giant fireplace right in the middle. Schindler was like, oops, you want a diagonal? I'll give you a diagonal, and made this huge diagonal all the way through the house from one corner window out the terrace. So you enter the house. This is the house from the street, and the entry is really here. And as you move around the house, you understand, in fact, how much it is of the hillside. And Schindler, when he intersects stuff, again, makes very complex intersections. Materials don't just slide past each other. And this is coming back around. So at the top of the house, you enter here, and then you slide in here and kind of do 180. And then you're here in the corner of the living room, and you see this, and you're drawn to the corner fireplace, you move in, and then you see this, which I always think is pretty amazing. So Schindler did some extremely clever things with the structure. It's all this kind of double cantilever, and where they start out with 2x12s, and it goes all the way down to 2x4s at the tip, where you don't need the weight and don't need the massing. And this actually covers a completely open air space that sends air and light down into the bedroom area below. And when you look up, you see this. There is actually a tiny piece of steel here. You can just see a bolt here and a bolt here. There's a little I-beam that holds up that corner that he puts in the drawings, but otherwise it's all held up seemingly by magic by all these cantilevered pieces. And there's these amazing diagonal views through the house in various and assorted ways, and out to the terrace. And this is actually, a lot of the furniture in the house is either reproductions, none of it's original, and some of it was actually designed in the 40s for a client of his named Beata Nye, who was actually small, who was smaller than I am, and designed lots of tiny little furniture for her that wound up in Lionel March. Lionel March, who I hired me at UCLA, drafted me into the Schindler Fest we had there in not 1887, I'm not 100 and some odd year, 1987, which unfortunately coincided with Le Corbusier's centennial. We're a little overshadowed, but and who asked me to edit this book we did on Schindler with him. This was his own house that he lived in for many years. Really beautiful house that Glenn has visited a couple of times, and anyway, it's a wonderful experience. So we're going to move on to yet another concrete experiment. This is actually back one year, 1924, the very oddball Packard House, which was kind of dark and woody, based partly on client's preferences, but has this fairly amazing plan on a triangular site, again, where Schindler made a kind of figure of ground balance out of it. And it used this, again, invented system where Schindler developed these movable frames that could move around the house, on which he sprayed on gunite, which later became a more common system, leaked like a sieve. He did not reproduce that. And now on to one of his more famous experiments, 1926 really is the major year of this, the Lovell Beach House, in which he experimented with the idea of concrete frames. And he did it by building one piece of formwork, pouring one frame and moving on to the next, again, as a way of saving some money. This is his most probably famous house, that and the Kingsford House, and this has been compared the most to international style architecture. But what you can see here, some of the real differences, is that this is not a neutral series, you know, like a platform with a series of round columns. It has a very definite shape, forming entrance, kind of playground off the beach, sleeping porch, double height living space, as you'll see here. The other thing you'll see is that there isn't a free plan. The structure is absolutely coincident with spatial divisions. There isn't that kind of dialogue in it. Here, and I'm sorry this is so poorly reproduced, but again, you can see the section here actually having a very definite shape that supports the section of the house. This is a very old fuzzy photograph taken in construction of the frames, where you can again see a very definite shape that the space architect was making here. These are some photographs, very old ones, of the inside and the outside. I'm going to show you one color photograph just because I like it, showing the main stair up to the living room and the back stair up to the kitchen, kind of just slicing through these columns, looking just phenomenally radical. Well, this was another experiment that was yet not repeated because, again, it was expensive. It went a little bit over budget. I'm just going to give one plug for Schindler. This house went wildly over budget, cost about $5,000 with the furnishings. Lovell later hired Neutra to design the Lovell Health House, which I'm just going to tell you cost $55,000. So this was a bargain. And the Lovell family sold the Health House. They still own this one. All right, not that I'm biased. All right, so this is another experiment that did not get built. Aileen Barnsdall hired Schindler to design a much lighter house for herself. And he basically took everything that was dark and heavy in the Hollyhock House and turned it into a translucent sloping roof here. This house was unfortunately not built. It was also a concrete one. You can just see here in the 7,000 sections our students drew that there was a big fireplace with these big cantilevered arms that supported this draped cantilever, which he did not, translucent roof, which he didn't really get to realize until, well, the Tischler House, 20 years later. This was 1927. Now, the last experiment in concrete I'm going to show you is the Wolf House, which Lindsay showed in the opening. A very beautiful house that was tragically demolished in 2002. Too painful to talk about. Schindler did very few models, but this amazing plywood model, which is about this big, is actually in the possession of the Friends of the Schindler House, though it's now, it's also eventually be given to the archive of all of Schindler's work in Santa Barbara. And it's I think, really an amazingly beautiful house that I think was very influential on Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water, and Wright absolutely saw renderings, drawings of this house. The idea of a kind of solid wall on one side and these kind of tiers falling into the landscape, very much Falling Water. And you can see it here in the drawings. And Schindler here experimented by making very thin floors where you just put down corrugated iron and poured a very thin layer of concrete in them. You can just see it here in this, well, you can't, it's a bit washed out here. On my laptop, you can see it. There's a corrugated here and a thin layer of concrete, allowing them to make these very thin floors, flying out into the landscape. And so what it looked like, these were some of the interiors. Again, very complex sections, as you can see, which is characteristic of all of Schindler's work. Again, as I said, tragically demolished. And he only did this one more time in the Elliott House of 1930, where he has one floor, which is this corrugated iron and concrete. And after that, he just simply couldn't afford it. The Depression started in 1929. He was lucky to have a lot of clients, but they did not have much money. And at a time when custom houses were being built for about $5 a foot, Schindler started building for about $3.50 a foot, and sometimes for as little as $2 a foot. And he did it because he was his own contractor from the beginning on everything but his apartment houses. And though he wanted to build in concrete, he loved the idea of the finished material and the construction material being the same. No matter how many experiments he did, it was just too expensive. So he started using what was then and now the cheapest system for residential architecture in Los Angeles, which is light wood frame covered in stucco and plaster. But he did make it his own. He made it his own, and he actually called it plaster skin design, and he found ways to make it interesting. So this is the Oliver House of 1933 to 4 in Silver Lake. And you can see that Schindler, it's an L-shaped house oriented with these spaces towards, in case you're unsure, view, arrow, view. What's it oriented towards? View. It's a great view, actually, of the reservoir below. So just like the Howe House, he turns it at 45 degrees to the street, essentially, to make a bunch of corner windows in view. So this house actually got published quite a lot, but you can see it had some similarities to International style, but you can see that Schindler's facades are not like flat planes like Neutra's. They're very heavily modeled. And Silver Lake had a requirement you had to have a pitched roof. Schindler was not that comfortable showing it from the street, but here it is. It's a very low hip that looks a lot like the Roby House. And then what he did with was really interesting. Instead of turning the hip 90 degrees, it just takes one side and brings it down. You'll see it on the inside of the fireplace. And again, opens it up completely to the outdoor patio. You enter the house, you come up half a level, you enter here, looking diagonally to the mountains, enter here, looking diagonally out to the view beyond. And you also see one of these compositions. You'll see more of these, built-in furniture, room divided in half, ingle nook, clear story, corner window open. Schindler, in a way like Lohse, used very heavily modeled plywood that he stained as a kind of contrast to the plaster walls. Also something that Gill did, so not ornamentation, but still contrast. There's a built-in piano behind it. You can play the piano, look at the fireplace, and look outside all at the same time. And Schindler really used the pitched roof on the inside. We can see he raised it up to allow, and he's just beginning to do this here, and we'll do it more and more, have interior clerestories, letting light all through the house. And again, no interior hallway. You actually have to walk through one bedroom to the other or walk outside underneath the overpass. And again, the sections are kind of fun and, well, difficult, I have to say, to figure out, but really interesting to look at. So this is the Walker House of 1935, and also in Silver Lake. Schindler did a number of these that there really was no buildable, no really accessible outdoor space because the sites sloped so much. From the street, completely closed to the street, except for these clear stories. But from the sides, and Schindler knew these sides are not very visible. There's houses right next to them. It looks like nobody bothered to design them, right? It's like these strange angles, like God knows what's going on. It seems kind of random. But the one facade you can see is kind of heroic, right? This kind of heroic facade. And Schindler did a lot of these where he kind of had a kind of solid edge and a breaks down. But he had to develop kind of terraces, which he does in a lot of his houses, where there is no place to kind of get a flat piece of ground and still makes the building relate directly to it. So in this house, you enter from the street here, and even I can see over this partition, and you're looking out towards the patio is right there, diagonally out. And you step down, and you have this great diagonal view of this huge piece of crazy built-in furniture. You can just see a hip here. The roof slopes in various directions to allow all these clear stories to appear. So for Schindler, light comes in from 3 or 4 directions in every room, and the roof is sculpted and modeled above this door height datum he always has to create those effects. The upholstery, whoops, I was going to say the upholstery, you can guess, is not original. And let me go back one. Schindler did, again, these amazing compositions of built-in furniture that I think were just a lot of fun for him to do. And again, the sections here, which took forever to figure out, again, very interesting. So Schindler also continued to experiment with materials. This was one of the cheapest houses, not the cheapest, but close to the cheapest house he ever did. It was for about $2.20 a square foot. And actually, he built it as a 2-bedroom house on top with a 1-bedroom rental unit below. And here Schindler discovered several clever things. If you took the plaster off the fireplace, it was cheaper. Cheaper than plaster, rolled roofing paper that you could just put on part of the house. Cheaper. And you'll see other things he did on the inside that were cheaper. Okay, so you see a theme here? Cheap. I actually wanted to call the Fiden book, Arm Schindler, The Search for Cheapness, but publisher didn't go for it, but it is chapter 5's title. Anyway, so this is the entrance. This is the entrance to the lower unit and the upper unit. And around the back is this, right, which became, as you will see, very influential on a whole bunch of LA architects from the 70s and the 80s. And when you enter the house, you enter, let me get this right, nope, up a stair. And you can see here the contrast of the plywood with the plaster. You're looking diagonally at the living room where the plaster fireplace, he sprang for plaster here, contrasted with the wood. And again, he discovered that if you just pulled all the plaster off and exposed the studs, it was cheaper. So he'd actually experimented a little earlier in this with a beach house up in Richmond, Northern California, which was all roofing paper on the outside with no plaster on the inside, which cost, I don't know, about $47 or something. Incredibly cheap house for a poet, of course, had very little money. This is what you see. The bookshelves are not original. But again, corner window, there's a tiny little balcony out there. And there's actually a little flat patio off the dining room that you can actually get to. It's an amazing little project, at least I thought. So I just want to, this is an image from the Schindler Fest where we built some of these frames. Schindler wrote an article in 1946, published in Architect and Engineer, called Reference Frames in Space, where he talked about his 4-foot, 3-dimensional proportional system divided into 16-inch or 1/3 modules, 1 2/3 door height. And we displayed them here. And he wrote about them both for their connection to human proportions and to standard American dimensions, again, imperial, 2x4s, 4x8s, et cetera. And this is actually a section of the Kings Road house that we had going up. We had to borrow block and tackle from the theater department at UCLA, kindly loaned it to us. And we have a film of everybody struggling with it and yelling at each other while it finally went up. And this is the Schindler frame. Schindler wrote an article in Architectural Record in the Technical News and Engineering section in 1947. And in it, he talked about the adaptations and alterations he'd made to the standard light wood frame in order to make space architecture. So what he didn't like about it was that you essentially had a bunch of 8-foot studs and you arranged them with really a load-bearing wall. Small openings, didn't like it. So instead, he made a couple of alterations. The first was he cut all studs to 6/8 or door height. And then he put it, so for the datum, and then he put a double plate there, sideways 2-bys, to establish a structural line. So you could put really big openings under it and do whatever you wanted with the roof over it and put in big clear stories. Then the other thing he did is instead of having a series of 2-bys in the floor and in the roof, he took 2-by decking, just wood decking, which could span 8 or 10 feet, and made these very, very, very thin floors and roofs, which enabled him to really do interesting things with the roofs. I'm going to show you a couple of examples. This is the Kalis House of 1946, which has just been lovingly and incredibly expensively restored, which is kind of fantastic. And it's kind of a crazy house. It's on a steeply sloping site. And the first thing you see, I apologize, these are a bit washed out here, is this kind of one-way slug-like carport, which kind of curves around the street and you can enter from either end. You then step down to this layer. It's kind of like a little canyon here, which only it's right here, where you only have the entrance to the house. Then you have the house, an outdoor terrace, and a studio with some terraces at the end, because there's a huge drop-off here. You can see actually in this drawing Schindler's 4-foot grid, which he put on all his drawings, all his working drawings on everything. Again, he said grid much better than adding up strings of unrelated dimensions. And as you move around the house, things happen. So here you can see the 2-by decking. Schindler described as a kind of very lightweight tent draped over the space. And he pulls it out past the surface as if to say, see, it's incredibly thin. So this is decking that pulls around. In the back of the house, instead of having a straight wall, everything here, all the walls are angled at 15 degrees. And he used grape stake siding on the bottom and overlapping plywood boards on the top, basically to break down the scale of this thing, which otherwise would have been quite huge. Misha Kalis, the owner, straightened up these windows. Long story I won't get into because I have a ton of material to cover. And the current owners have straightened out the ones in the studio. We hope they will do these ones soon. But you can see how steep it is. And as you come around to this, which it's very well known for, which is this butterfly roof section. And the butterfly, again, everything's at 15 degrees. It's done. Schindler begins post-war to bring back corridors into his work, which he kind of abandoned before. But whenever he does them, he lights them in really interesting ways. So here, there's these butterflies allow clear story lighting into this hallway, which is actually used as a gallery. And here you can see this kind of canyon where you come down the stairs and enter into this kind of little cave. And this is what you see on the inside. You're looking at diagonally at this. They've since taken the paint off this. This is all now wood again. Schindler started doing these things. We started building cabinets through the walls so that they opened into the kitchen on this side, the bedroom on this side. And that meant that in the corridor, you're walking in a narrow space, but your shoulders and head are in a much wider space, which opens up even more at the top with clerestory lighting. You can see here that Schindler started to do, he did a whole bunch of these very interesting kind of kitchen nooks with corner windows looking out into the main space and layers of clerestory. And you can see here he's using the decking spanning 8 feet over these big beams to make this incredibly thin roof that he shapes in this butterfly form. Schindler also anchors the building with these leopard spot fireplaces, clearly influenced by Wright's 1938 Taliesin West, which he was clearly looking at. But instead of making a lot of it, Schindler only uses it for the fireplace and makes everything else super light in every possible way. This is a studio now used as a bedroom. And you can see that the fireplace has this 15-degree angle, repeated 15-degree angle over. Again, these windows were just put back on the angle, which is kind of magical. And downstairs, there were 2 separate bedrooms for Kalis's grown sons, entered completely separately. But you can see that here he didn't bother to put the leopard spot stone in the fireplace. But you can see these 2 L shapes, which are canted at 15 degrees, both in plan and section to each other. And you can see in the master bedroom in the main house, this kind of complex composition that Schindler makes out of pretty much everything in terms of the built-in furniture. And again, the sections of the house, which really talk about the kind of butterfly nature. And again, not just done for effect, which Hitchcock, A.J. Chick, famous historian, compared Schindler's post-war work to science fiction and being influenced by Hollywood, and extremely insulting. Anyway, clearly didn't get it. It wasn't about effects like that. It was about the interior space and about lighting it and about space, climate, light, and mood. So I'm just going to show you, I think 2 more houses. This is the Armin house of 1946 to 9. Looks like nothing from the street, really. But if you look at the plan and the clerestory plan, there's a whole bunch of crazy 15-degree shifts going on. So something interesting must be happening. You know, not really here. But here you begin to see, again, solid begins to break down at the terrace until really all hell breaks loose on the corner, where you get this kind of explosion of 15-degree things going on. And when you enter right here and are looking out a corner window. And there's these odd little 15-degree slices of things kind of traveling through the space, not at great speed, fortunately. And you see here, this is really, I think, one of my favorite of his kind of little ediculas, these kind of spaces within a space with like 15-degree stuff happening everywhere. Again, it's just a kitchen nook. You know, then kitchens were not open. They were kind of closed, but Schindler made these kind of little seating areas where you could see through a corner out. We actually managed to photograph this just as the original client was moving out, which was kind of amazing. And she told us that there used to be glass up here, and once her husband and young daughter were playing on the floor, and the glass just like fell right out, just missing them, and said, yeah, we didn't replace it. So this is the bedroom. It's like a little piece of wood looking out on the terrace here, and again, a 15-degree angle for the terrace just to make a little kind of dining area right here. And again, the sections may not seem very exciting, but when you combine them with all of this, pretty interesting. Okay, so this is the last house, Schindler house, I'm going to show you. This is the Tischler house of 1949 to 50. And this is one of his, a few they did, using a material that came on the market after the war called Austenite, which is really just corrugated colored fiberglass. We now use it for garden sheds or something like that. But I think in this house, after all these experiments with shifts and angles, he felt that the translucent roof was so powerful spatially that he could just use incredibly basic pieces of geometry. You know, basically a bar, circles, a square, and nothing else was needed. This house recalls the Packard house, which I showed you a long time ago, but also the translucent house, where he was finally able, we're going to see in a minute, to do this blue translucent roof. So unlike all the other houses in the street, and this was the last one built, Adolf Tischler himself, the original guy, lived here until 2015, and said that All the other houses were already built, and the neighbors were like up in arms about this house because they thought it was so weird. But you know, it's LA. Nobody cares. You can't stop it. So they built this strange house, and all the other houses kind of leveled off a piece in the middle and popped the house in the middle of it. Schindler moved the house all the way to the north side and lifted the living space all the way to the top to open up as much space as possible to usable outdoor space. So as you can probably see, you come up the stairs here, past what was a carport, later enclosed, and was Adolph's studio, later became a bedroom. And you enter on these little bridges with no rails or a rail, you know, and you can begin to see this kind of step pink concrete block. You probably cannot make out, there's a little wide flange beam in there. And you enter here into this crazy space, this kind of compressed space, pink staggered block behind the fireplace. This is a big tie rod holding that gable roof together. This kind of cutout drop ceiling made of his textured decking. He did individualized custom texturing for each of these houses. And you come into the big space. Originally, and in fact, the blue roof does go all the way up. And Schindler thought once the trees grew up, it would be totally fine and not hot. And Adolph said you could fry an egg on the floor, you know, even after the trees grew up. So he wound up covering about half the roof. You can actually see it on the outside. Schindler did very unusually a kind of reflective fireplace. He didn't like reflectors on the inside. He thought that was not the right place for him. In 1952, he wrote an article called Visual Techniques, outlining all his techniques, not published till much later after he died. Very straightforward about color, reflectors, translucence, everything, which I urge you to read. It was very unusual, but Adolph was a silversmith, and he just felt it was the right thing to do here. And Adolph himself, even though Schindler designed it, Adolph actually built that fireplace. And you can see that even here, there is a diagonal view out to this terrace. And when you go outside, you see this. And again, usable outdoor space. You can just see a lump on the roof here. We're going to see what that's about on the inside. So this is the master bedroom. And it's the one room, it becomes a square, slides outside that roof. And let me just go back a second. You'll see that over that bedroom, he didn't put a blue roof. I think that maybe the clients didn't want a kind of hot blue roof in their face when they woke up, and which I'm sure you can understand. So this is the room, and he does a bunch of interesting things here. The decking is on a 45 degree. I think it's partly just to hold everything together. But the top plate here is a 4x8 turned sideways, and it's turned sideways so that the rods, there are several of them in the house, have 8 inches, or really 7¼ inches to go through, you know, to hold that rod in place to keep the gable from falling down. But the problem with that is that it wouldn't span across the bedroom. So you can just see a couple of bolts here with that little wide flange sitting on top, holding it together. Schindler used every material he'd ever used in this house in one way or another. And you can see the block, the shiny thing, the tie rod, wood, plaster. I don't know what I'm leaving out, but really almost everything here as he described its use. So sadly, and again, we could have cut like 12 more sections in this house, but every place you cut the sausage, it comes out differently. It's kind of an amazing thing. So Schindler did not do much work after this. He became ill and passed away in 1953, a month shy of his 66th birthday. And I think he would have continued to invent and use new materials and do crazy things. And because they were so crazy, his work in the 20s got published a lot, less and less after that, and the post-war work hardly at all. And it took years and years and years and years for anybody to come around to see that the post-war work was really interesting. But people in LA began to appreciate it. Let me go back, like Schindler, go back to his lack of recognition. So I'm sure you all recognize this. Mies van der Rohe's Far North South, 1949. Schindler was like, been there, done that 20 years ago. You know, it's like flat roofs, open to the outside, construction system, yeah, did it. Like, I moved on, what's your... So, Frank Gehry, you probably have heard of Frank Gehry, famous architect. Okay, so Frank Gehry in LA actually visited the Schindler house and met Schindler a number of times as a young architect, and was clearly enormously influenced by his work in using cheap materials and exposing studs. We've seen it before, haven't we? In this house from 1935. And he also influenced, this is an early house by Morphosis when Tom Main and Michael Rotundi were still working together. Michael Rotundi grew up in Silver Lake, surrounded by Schindler, and he said very specifically that this house completely influenced them when they were designing. This is the 2468 house from, I'm going to have to look at the date, I think it's 1978. It is, it's 1978 in Venice in California. And you can see, again, it uses shingles on the outside, roofing material on the outside, and exposes things. And it was also enormously influenced on an architect named Frank Israel, who's very famous for a while, died fairly young of AIDS, tragically, in the 90s. But his office was actually in Schindler's garage for several years, and he was enormously influenced by Schindler after Schindler had passed away. And you can see, again, the De Keyser house, which I showed you earlier, and these ideas of these kind of spaces within spaces, these kind of ediculas that Schindler used all the time. Like here in the Armin house, these kinds of things. And Frank Israel, who taught at UCLA, I taught with Frank, was enormously familiar with Schindler's work. And younger generations, this is Marmel and Radziner's prefab desert house, and they talk extremely specifically about the influence of the King's Road house on their work. And we had this very interesting thing happen. The Los Angeles Times, God knows why, decided to quiz a bunch of architects and historians in LA about which was the best house or the most famous, most significant house in LA. And the Schindler house came out as #1. I don't know if you have those here, those big foam fingers, that say #1. Anyway, I wanted to get one of those. I went to a Foch board meeting at some place in Beverly Hills. I wanted to walk in with a big finger, we're #1. Anyway, you can see that Schindler is much appreciated in LA, though for a long time not. We had the big Schindler Fest in '87, and I keep joking that I've written all these Schindler books to try to make the houses worth more for what they are so people won't tear them down and build a McMansion on the site. And we've had some success with that, maybe not as much as we could have. But now I'm going to make an awkward transition and show you a little bit of other work, a little bit of my work. And this is not my work, but another architect, just thought I'd say that, some of you may know this, another architect who was really influenced by Schindler was Charles Moore, who was at UCLA for a long time. And Charles Moore wrote about Schindler and appreciated his hillside siting. Schindler never designed a house until he saw the site, made it extremely particular to the site, the view, the climate, the overhangs. And Moore was clearly influenced by this work. And many of you probably know this. This is Condominium 1 at Sea Ranch from 1965, Moore, Linden, Turnbull, Whitaker. And Sea Ranch was kind of a turning point for a lot of people. Critical regionalism, a title nobody ever liked. We blame Ken Frampton for that. But the idea that instead of doing high modernism, you actually look at vernacular architecture. They're looking at northern barns and made this rather extraordinary building, I think, that sits in this great landscape. And I'm going to apologize. These slides aren't great. This is the courtyard, and it's very hard to photograph the interior of the Charles Moore because it's very vertical, and it has these amazing objects in it. It has this bedroom supported on 4 logs, makes a space in an edicula, and this object, which is the kitchen and the bathroom up above. And Moore had been doing a bunch of these kind of ediculas, these spaces within spaces, and very complex interiors, clearly related to Schindler. The other architect who did a lot of work up there was Joe Escherich, very early. He did a bunch of these hedgerow houses. For those of you who don't know, Sea Ranch was 10 miles of coast, and originally, Moreland and Turnbull Whitaker, Joe Escherich, and Lawrence Halpern, the landscape architect, did the design for it. And things changed somewhat after that, but they still have strict design guidelines. Maybe, still some of the houses are not as Sea Ranchy as they could be, but there's a lot of houses up there designed by a lot of well-known architects, and it's kind of an architect's hangout. I'm sure some of you have had the pleasure of being there. This is the hedgerow house by Joe Escherich, again, his own house, buried in the hillside here. And this is a view when you come from the entry side. There's a stream here, and there's often these south-facing terraces because there's enormous wind there. The hedgerows are there to kind of break up the wind. There's these, I just want to go back, because there's these strict plans about building around the meadow and not in the middle of the meadow. They maintain views and all kinds of nice things. But this, like the Moore condo, there's lots of built-in benches. That's a big thing. And here, You enter at the kitchen level, step up to the living room, step up a few steps to another bedroom, step up again, then you're in a bedroom, which is a balcony overlooking the living room again. So there's all these sea ranchy things that go on. And I, with my then design partner, Norman Millar, who I say sadly passed away in 2016, very young. And we were lucky enough to get a project in Sea Ranch for a friend of ours, Gabriel Ramirez, who wanted to live on the ocean. So he got one of the last, but there aren't many left on the ocean. And one of the reasons this lot was available, it's on this amazing cove, is that you can see these sea caves down below. So you couldn't build in the center of the site, facing the ocean. So we built a house here, and you're going to see a little guest house here kind of straddling this. And as you'll see, we built the houses kind of up with the sections so that every room would actually have the view. So this is the house from the street side. So this is the house. This is the guest house. And this is a berm. People have said things like, oh, it's really great how you worked into the landscape with that hill. It's like, that berm didn't exist. We made the berm. There's that berm is over the garage. Anyway, but there are a number of houses by a very good architect named Obi Bowman, who has some beautiful houses with these berms. And there's these great photographs of deer on the berms. And we, of course, have seen deer on the berm, which is very exciting. So, but we love the idea that I thought that we just worked it into the landscape. Ooh, aren't we clever? Yeah, anyway. So this is a site plan of the house. So the house is here, sea caves here, guest house here. And again, one of the south-facing patios, which you need, again, strong winds. This is Northern California, not Southern California. And this is a section of the house. You can see here, again, that it steps up. This is the master bedroom. And you don't have many clients who will let you leave their master bedroom open to everything in the house. It's kind of amazing. This is the one room that is not really open to, this is the wine cellar beneath the study. This is Northern California. You must have a wine cellar, and you'll see several hot tubs. This is Gabriel's study. He's a radiologist, works from home, does not need the view, works at night. So that's the one room without the view. And this is the garage buried under the berm. So this is the garage, berm, garage. So it was down a little. And the house took us 5 years to get through design review. It was really a nightmare. And they would send us these long list of corrections. And then Richard Whitaker from Whitaker, MLTW, Whitaker is the W, who's the chair of the board, leave us these long phone messages encouraging us. But this is a great new direction. It was mostly because we wanted to use Core 10, and we thought we were paying homage to everything. But anyway, after we finally got it through, everybody started doing it. And they got through in like no time at all. And anyway, this house we started in 2004, finally finished in 2012, just before I moved to Oregon. But you can see it's board form concrete at the bottom. And then there's a kind of U-shape, kind of a tube on top of corrugated steel. And the wood on the outside is ipe, which withstands, I think, sustainably harvest, at least we hope so, which is unbelievably hard, will withstand just about anything. And as you come into this is what the house looks like. There's, for reasons that are still not totally clear, even to me, even though for some reason I was the one who did this, I generally, I have to say, you don't know why you do things sometimes. In general, I'm not a tweaker with the geometry, but for some reason I just did it here. This wall is 6 degrees out. It's just really to open it up to the ocean. And then these are rotated at 15 degrees, both the garage and the fireplace, which is inside and out. This was essentially for practical reasons, to kind of make this corner and make all this happen. But otherwise, the house is pretty straightforward. One of the things they asked us to do at one of the many, many reviews was to add more pop-outs on the inside. They thought we were like too plain. So we added some pop-outs. And actually, one on each side. It's like, OK, there's the pop-outs. You OK now? And they finally were. But they actually turned out to be, like a lot of things they made us do, which we were very sulky about, we were actually very happy about in the end. This is one of them. And this is one of the 2 copper hot tubs. The guest house has its own, just in case you want privacy. This is the plan of the house. This is actually the wine cellar, but this is a big open space kitchen, et cetera. It steps up. There's these bathroom objects, which you'll see. There's a study here, and then this is Gabriel's office, which you get to from the garage. And the upper level, again, these are very pale, I apologize. You step up, study, bathroom, master bedroom, closet, bathroom. Again, these kind of objects in the space like Charles Moore. And this is the interior. These are shear walls, which you need in California, you know, seismic and all. And this is the house, this is one very complicated built-in piece. You can, I hope, see a little bit influence, not just from Charles Moore, but also from Schindler, with these kind of objects on the inside and built-in things and that kind of stuff. This is looking outside to the south-facing patio. And again, I apologize, these are my own, not really fabulous photographs. And looking, again, up to the sleeping area. This is the corner fireplace. So you can look at the view and the storms, which are frequent, and fires, which Gabriel's energetic enough to use all the time. Traditional bench, which you always have in a sea ranch house, where a lot of people just like to sleep. This is looking down from the master bedroom, so you can't quite see because it's blown out, but from every point, you actually really can see the view. And you can see it's a bit of a wood medley on the inside. We didn't have mass timber at the time, or maybe I would have used it. But this is the end grain Doug fir. This is vertical grain Doug fir. This is a marine grade Doug fir plywood around. There's the Falk Apartments of 1939. Schindler did this amazing plywood ceiling that wraps around like this. Again, a little bit of Schindler influence crept its way into here. And this is the pop-out, actually, which turned out to be kind of great. You can see like the ocean 2 ways from it. And during construction, when there was dust everywhere, you'd come up and see this little patch here with no dust, you know, where people are always sitting eating their lunch. It was kind of great. This is the little study in the middle of the house. And this is one of the bathrooms where we have these fantastic copper tubs. And again, a client who knew what he wanted and wanted to spend his money, which is fantastic. I said the first client I've had with better taste than the architects. And this is the guest house. No, seriously, Gabriel has better taste than we do. Kept coming up with things like, oh, you want to use copper? Would it be nice to use copper? Yes, it would be quite nice to use copper. That's a great idea. So this is the little guest house. Again, it's kind of a miniature covered in Corten, little object here. This is the patio in front, which is a little deeper, actually, because we had space on the site for it. And the inside, again, it's kind of a miniature where there's a little bed sleeping area and living room, and again, it steps down, so everything has the view. Plan, again, bathroom, hot tub, bathroom, closet. And this is a view down and out. So you can see the section, all the built-ins, of course, and this is, I think there might be one more, fireplace. Yeah, looking up. So it was great fun to do this and a great privilege. I unfortunately have not been building since I moved to Oregon, but I'm hoping. We had a great contractor who's trying to find me the right client to build a little mass timber house, which is my very awkward transition to the last bit of this. I promise this is the last bit of the lecture. So Lindsay asked me to talk a little bit. I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about the tall wood design. Do I? Because I talk so fast? How am I doing?
Another 10 or 15 minutes.
Well, perfect. All right, because I planned 10 minutes for this bit. So I think that's the fastest I've ever gotten through a Schindler talk, because I usually ramble on about all kinds of stuff. So this is the Tallwood Design Institute, and that's actually why I'm here in Australia right now, as Lindsay told you. Through, I don't know, things happen in life. I mean, I never really intended to be a Schindler scholar. I came to UCLA for a one-year visiting position, and Lionel March just drafted me into the Schindler Fest and asked me to co-edit a book with him, and then somebody asked me to write another book and another book and another book, and before you know, you've written more than anybody else. And with the Tallwood design, that started accidentally too. My colleague at Cal Poly Pomona, where I taught for many years, Michael Gershfield, who's sitting in the back, is a professor of engineering and a timber specialist, and decided that the engineers should work with the architects to design some timber bridges. So we taught some joint studios with his engineering and my architecture students doing timber bridges, and because architecture students design crazy stuff, Michael started looking at things. He discovered this stuff in Europe called cross-laminated timber, which we could use for the decking. And then I moved to Oregon, and I already knew something about wood. And the new dean at the College of Forestry at Oregon State, and I should explain that University of Oregon has architecture and law. Oregon State has forestry, engineering, and agriculture, and the medical school is completely independent up in Portland. So the dean of the College of Forestry wanted to start a mass timber research institute. And he decided, and I was very flattered by this, that architects were vital. Really? Architects vital? I don't hear that much. And because we really do push new materials forward and select the materials. So we formed this partnership and made a pitch to the Oregon State Legislature. And Oregon is a timber state. Huge history of timber. But since the 70s, due to both forest management practices, Endangered Species Act, automation, the timber industry has really shrunk dramatically, and there is huge poverty in most of the rural areas in Oregon. And the idea that you could develop a new sustainable product that sequesters carbon and start high-tech jobs in completely rural areas was just amazing. And the legislature loved the idea that the two flagship universities, which have this huge football rivalry and are not supposed to speak to each other, work together. And I have a slide, I didn't show it here, well, because I thought it would require too much explanation, but I'm about to explain it anyway. University of Oregon, we're the ducks, and Oregon State University are the beavers. So the Tallwood Design Institute, we use the platypus as our symbol, which the state legislature finds hilarious, and we show it every time we talk to them about money. So it's a unique partnership. We like to keep them laughing, but also we've done a lot for the economy in the state. We're the mass timber epicenter now of the US. We're about in the same stage as Australia, which is why we're very interested in being here. And I came for this Pacific Timber Engineering Conference, and we met with the Future Timber Hub up in Brisbane, and it looks like we're gonna work out some collaborations to share research and ideas, which we're all very excited about. And so we brought these three divisions together, forestry, engineering, and architecture, and we do, well, lots of stuff. So we do applied research. We do research, testing, outreach, and education. And we do a lot of structural research, and really a lot of it is based on seismic work, because we're in a very big seismic zone. A lot of research in Europe, but only Italy is in a seismic zone, so a lot of that still has to be done, and we've been experimenting with some very interesting lateral force resisting systems coming out of New Zealand right after the Christchurch earthquake. And we are experimenting with the first rocking wall system. I'm not going to explain it in detail. Here in PV Hall, it's actually much further along now, but this is the new Oregon State University College of Forestry, and designed by Michael Green, architect, Vancouver. I still think we should have used an Oregon architect, but anyway, we now have Oregon architects with lots of experience. So Andre Barboso, you saw on the last slide, from engineering, did a bunch of testing around putting, splicing in and epoxying in rods to connect CLT panels in these tall rocking walls. And the idea is, you can see there are these cutouts for rods that go all the way up. And then on the sides of these panels, they put some, and you can just see one here, some steel U's. And then there's panels where the steel U's meet each other. And the idea is that in a seismic event, the rods will allow the panel to rock. And these U's will dissipate energy. And if they break, they break. But the panels will just self-center and go back into place. And this was adapted by some PhD students of Andy Buchanan's at the University of Canterbury from work done on precast concrete at UC San Diego in Southern California, the huge shake table. So it came back to us on the West Coast, really through an engineer, Eric McDonald, who'd been working with home structures in Christchurch. He's an American, and came back to Portland and introduced us to a number of these techniques. And this is the first rocking wall experiment going up, which we're very excited about. We also do a lot of other testing. This is one of our faculty members, Erica Fisher. There's Erica, doing some fire testing. We're building a fire testing lab slowly. This was actually done in a lab up in Ottawa. And we're doing some acoustic testing. This was done at a lab in Illinois, and we're slowly building our own acoustic testing lab as we get grants and funding to do this. We also help make new products. This is a brand new product called Mass Plywood, made by a plywood factory in Lyons, Oregon. The first, I should have said, the first cross-laminated timber structurally certified in the United States was made by D.R. Johnson in Riddle, Oregon. And faculty from Oregon State were extremely instrumental in helping with that. Our faculty were also helpful in developing both the factory and doing all the evaluation and testing for Mass Plywood. So the first CLT was certified in 2015. This was structurally certified in 2018. We encourage you to look at this product. It's fantastic. And we have used it. This is a photo of our new Emerson lab, which is the new home of Tallwood. It's just been finished, and this is a big strong wall for structural testing. In this part, which you cannot see, we have a CNC machine and a big robot arm and a CLT press and all kinds of fancy machines that we're setting up now. Excuse me, and the walls, this is all mass plywood, which went up incredibly quickly and easily. 3 inches thick, little rabbit edge, 40 foot long, because it's 20-foot bay, went up incredibly quickly. I joke that I should be on their sales force, and anyway, as I promote it. We're also doing all kinds of other experiments with looking at using ponderosa pine, which is being cleared out of Eastern Oregon forests for forest health. They're beginning to realize that stopping all forest fires means that you just burn huge forest fires, huge problem on the West Coast, biggest source of carbon in the atmosphere. So they're now culling out small diameter logs, which of course is what you use in engineered timber of all kinds, not old growth. And we're looking at lower value species like ponderosa to see if we can use it in CL2, perhaps in middle layers like in glulam, where we use the best fir, and of course Douglas fir, Oregon fir, the best structural fir in the world. Really, not just bragging, right? It's totally true. We're looking to see if we can use lesser species, maybe in the middle layers. And this is, we have a faculty member looking at reclaiming wood, used 2x4s, to see if we can use that in CLT. Probably too expensive to do. Removing the nails is difficult, but we're looking at it. And some of the labs at U of O, we're doing the acoustic testing. We're doing net zero. This was we have a climate chamber. It's a room that is instrumented all around, and you can change all the surfaces. And you know, we specialize in passive heating and cooling at University of Oregon, and they use night flush a lot, which depends on thermal mass. So the question is, how do you get to net zero with CLT, with mass timber, just less thermal mass? So we have some people working on that in our lab, and they did a number of interesting things. This is an experiment in perception of thermal comfort, and they actually now have data to show that in a wood environment, when it's cold, you feel a little warmer, and when it's hot, you feel a little cooler. And it means you can heat and cool the air about 2 to 3 degrees less, which is a huge energy savings. People are very excited by this finding. And they're also looking at other ways of getting to net zero. They're also looking at air quality. We have a lab that works with the biology department, biology and built environment. They've been doing typing interior biomes for health, and biomes is a kind of big hot field right now. And they're looking at volatile organic chemicals to see, because of course wood naturally produces formaldehyde, and they're trying to figure out what is okay formaldehyde, what might not be, and it's very controversial. And anyway, and our labs are doing it. We were told we better get the right results, and we were like, the data is the data, right? We're a university, you know, so we are very, very tightly connected to industry, and we have industry consultants. So we have about $1 million a year in federal funds to fund this research. It's competitive just among our faculty, and we have an industry panel that decides what's important, but there are some problems occasionally with things like that. Like, we don't want the results of those tests, but we do want the results of the tests. So most of the time we get along very well with industry. And I, on the other hand, do what is called design research, which I know that people in engineering don't always consider research, but I've been working with some manufacturers. We're trying to get some modular projects going, a modular mass timber classroom and housing. It's a long story, but I'm just going to show you a couple of projects that I work on with my students. I teach mass timber studios, and Michael Gershfield, my engineering colleague, is kind enough to commute up to Oregon to work with me on these things, because we think that the best way to work on mass timber projects is integrated teams, architect, engineers, contractors, and manufacturers all working together from the beginning for the most efficient and really feasible projects.
Probably about 5 minutes.
Yeah, I'm just going to show. I think I've got 5 minutes here. I think I'm going to be right on time, but thank you. Right. So one of the things we do is sometimes everybody in Oregon is so excited about this that cities and counties sometimes ask us to do studios as feasibility studies. So the mayor of Springfield, which is next to Eugene, which is where my university is, asked us to do a mass timber parking garage in a new development they were doing, which most people thought was a fairly insane idea to try to do this in a seismic zone. So I called Michael and said, so after I'd already said yes to them, I said, can we do a mass timber parking garage? And he laughed, which I thought is not a good sign in an engineer. And then said, well, we'll call it an R&D studio and we're going to see. So we found these new lateral force resisting systems and post-tensioning systems, and we actually made a pretty convincing case of it. This is one that used, you can see the rods and some split rings here. And we produced about 9 projects, and this uses some you can just see these columns are a little fatter than the edge ones. That's where the post-tensioning is. It's another one. We also use some, wood cross bracing and other things. And we convinced them to make it a real project, which is really amazing, which SRG, Eric McDonald, working on this. It's not up yet. They're waiting for a hotel and convention center to commit who's going to be the client for this. But it spawned a lot of research in durability because there's an issue in keeping wood structures open during construction. And a parking garage is basically a wood structure that's always in construction. So we've been doing a lot of studies on wind-driven rain and coatings and other things. So it spawned a lot of very interesting research. And the last project I'm going to show you, Lindsay, is this one that we did with Lane County, which is where Eugene and Springfield are. They wanted to do a new courthouse. And again, they're desperate to kind of demonstrate how safe this is and how beautiful it is. So they want to do it in civic buildings. So they asked us to do, again, a feasibility study. And Michael again came up to join us. And I worked on both these projects with another colleague of mine, Mark D'Onofrio. My department has a background in both architecture and engineering. And we did about 5 projects. I'm just going to show you 3. This one used these curved CLT towers of courtrooms that we found in an example in France of curved CLT, so we know it exists and somehow somebody can make it. We decided to do one tower because why not? Just to demonstrate that it can be done. And on Michael's advice, we started in concrete and then went to steel and then wood for the upper stories as it got lighter. And we did one with an enormous roof spanning like 240 feet with these trusses made out of wood with a wood king post and tension rods coming up. And our students also did a number of studies of energy use, showing you could source everything from about 100 miles away. Bioswales, they're very big on bioswales. And we also did, not on these slides, but energy calculations, carbon sequestration, all that kind of stuff. Now, tragically, this was going to be financed by a bond, which had to go up to a vote in May and did not pass. So we're not sure what's going to happen. But Clackamas County, which is near Portland, also wants to do a mass timber courthouse and have just engaged us to do another courthouse feasibility study that we're going to do in the studio in our fall, which is September, which is when our school year starts. And so we hope that one will actually get built. And again, these are meant to be demonstration projects, so the public can come into them and see them and feel them and touch them and say, wow, if it's a courthouse and there's a sheriff's department, it must be safe. And we hope to, just like in Australia here, continue to promote this work. So that is the end, Lindsay. I hope it was right on time, right? And thank you.